My name, as many of you know, my name is John Wood, the Interim Executive Director for the American Scientific Affiliation. And welcome this afternoon to our November brown bagger. This is the second brown bagger that we've held this fall. And, this afternoon, it's such a pleasure to have Erin Smith with us. Erin Smith is the Fletcher Jones Endowed Professor of Research. She's Associate Professor of Psychology at California Baptist University there in the Riverside area in sunny, wonderful Southern California. Those of us here at the northern part of the continent, I'm in Edmonton. We had our first major snow this last weekend. I was away. My wife got to do the shoveling, so I owe her for that. I see Mark McEwen with us. He's in the lower mainland of BC, where they've had massive flooding. And so weather seems to be on the minds of some of us these days, but that's not our attention this afternoon. The brown baggers are an opportunity for us to take presentations that have been made at our annual meetings and to repurpose those and bring those back to you live together with the author. And so Erin is with us today, so we can have about a 30-40 minute presentation that she has given this last summer at our annual meeting. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So Erin, we'd like to get to know you a little bit. Folks have seen your bio. It's in the announcement that we sent out, so they can click on that and go through the details of your accomplishments. I know there's a couple of things there. You're 16 years married and 3 children. I think I got it as 8, 6, and 2. And you were saying to us earlier that the COVID shots are in the works for these children this week. And that's challenging. Erin, I'm a grandfather with 3, 8, 6, and 4. And so I have some sense, secondarily, but some sense of the challenges that you're dealing with in the family. That's wonderful on that side. Erin has been a part of the visiting scholar at the Wycliffe College Scholarship on Christianity at Oxford program. That was in the past, Erin, and you've done other kinds of research. You've also been the director of the research center there on the study of human behavior. So I see research as your focus, and we're going to hear some of that today as we go on. But tell me, how did you get to Point Loma Nazarene for your undergraduate? How did that happen?
As with many things in my life, a little bit of happenstance. I applied to a couple of local, I'm born and raised Southern California, applied to a couple of local universities. Both of my parents are Biola grads. And so I think they were a little optimistic that I would end up in La Mirada, but I ended up with a better financial package at Point Loma. And so I chose very practically, after kind of ruling out and only applying to schools that were in the realm of where I wanted to be. And I had really no idea what was in store for me, as I think is probably the case of most 17-year-olds applying for college. But I'm grateful for how God blessed decisions that I didn't even really understand that I was making.
Exactly. And so that takes you from there to UC Riverside and a master's and PhD program. Just a snippet on that and the highlights about the direction that led you to where you are today.
Yeah. So again, just one of these, I think I mentioned to you in an email yesterday, my students are always shocked to find out that when I was an undergraduate, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, because as they engage with me as a professional, I seem to have a very clear and dedicated idea of my trajectory. And so some of them who know me well, I tell them, when I was in your shoes, it was my intention to go work for a rental car company because they seem to always be hiring, and I thought I'd be able to get a job. I had no idea what was available to me. And then I had a faculty member who I really respected just encourage me to think bigger than what I was thinking. And so I decided to apply for graduate school. It's one of these things. I didn't know what I didn't know and how ridiculous my applications were like, knowing what I know now, I don't think I would have applied because my application would have been so weak. But I'm glad I didn't know and took the risk and managed in all the applications I sent to get one who said, okay, I'll take a risk on you. And from that point, I just kept walking through doors to pursue questions that were interesting and opportunities that were available to me. I said yes as many times as I could. And through that progress, ultimately, like my master's thesis is on something that's in the realm of what my PhD work was in and in the realm of what I'm doing now, but it was a totally different orientation. Opportunities came up to kind of switch to studying religious cognition. I said, yes, I did that, and just kind of kept moving forward until I'm now here at CBU 10 years in.
Right. Yeah, I'm watching heads nod across the screen of those of you who've got your cameras on, and I think many of us identify with that kind of path. It's much clearer as you look backwards than it is as we look forward. But today we're not going to look at the wake of the boat and where that's been, as marvelous as it is. You're going to turn our attention forward to a very important challenge that we all deal with. Data don't speak. People do. How to have better conversations about science and faith. And I know this touches on a research area. You're interested in the interface with psychology and theological anthropology. These are fascinating and important areas. So we're looking forward to it. We're going to ask Mark to start the presentation that you made this summer. We'll listen to that, and then we'll come back for a Q&A.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. So my name is Erin Smith, and I am a research psychologist, which means I am not a therapist. I am not licensed to get inside your mind, but instead I use empirical methods of research and I apply them to questions of human thinking and behavior. One area of research that I'm interested in concerns Christian engagement with science. And one thing that this research makes clear is that if we want to understand why Christians do and why they don't engage with science, we have to understand a variety of cognitive and cultural influences. In that vein, I've grown interested in what we can do as scientists and as Christians to better communicate issues at the intersection of science and Christianity, and to communicate in a way that might impact individuals' engagement with both. I got interested in this research when I started hearing about data around why people were leaving the church, right? And so when you look at young people, science is on kind of the big hit, the top 5 list of reasons why they leave the church, because they perceive it to be anti-science. And so here you have a group of individuals that are saying, if it's science or faith, I choose science. But then we also see in culture individuals who say, well, if it's science or faith, obviously the science is wrong and my interpretation of the faith is correct. And so in both of these groups, you have really the same outcome. I'm rejecting one source of truth about the world in favor of the other. And what I'm particularly interested in is if there might be ways that we can communicate about issues at the intersection of science and faith that make these two groups smaller and instead increase the size of the group in the middle, the people who are going to say, let's do the hard work of having difficult conversations where science and Christianity both have claims to this territory, and how can we use both of these tools of knowledge to ultimately increase our understanding of this world that God has put us in. And so with that in mind, for the next few minutes, I'd like to talk through some ideas about how we can leverage psychological science to improve science-faith communication. So when we talk about science and faith content, right, I talk about this intersection of science and faith, the content there where they cross over. We have to keep in mind that there are at least 2 layers of things that we are talking about. There's the content, right, the actual bits of information that we want to communicate, right, what the science says, what the data show. But then there are the persons, right, the people who are doing the communicating. And as my talk is titled, data don't speak, people do. Right? And so we can't think about the science-faith dialogue if we don't account for the fact that there is data and then there are the people communicating the data. And again, this sounds a little bit self-evident, but I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle that we so often ignore. Often as scientists, we are drawn to the data, right? We love data. And this love leads us to believe that it is with data that minds are swayed and hearts are won, right? If only they could understand this graph, then of course they would see that what I believe is obviously the case, right? This is what we think, kind of being won over ourselves with the data. However, what psychological research indicates is that when we jump straight to this content, to the data, to the graphs, we often make impossible the very thing that we want: open, unbiased conversation and the possibility of belief change in light of data. Research consistently shows that there is a lot of knowledge in scientific data and other truths that is not self-evident, right? It's not just that we kind of get exposed to this knowledge or information. It's not that we get exposed to data and boom, we believe it as it is. That is not what research says happens. And so I want to talk a little bit about what psychology says about engaging the person to make the content a viable option for discussion and understanding. And so my primary focus in our time together is going to be on just kind of a broad category of conversations that we might call difficult, right? Difficult conversations. These conversations, the content of these conversations will vary as a function of who is in them, because what is difficult for one person is not necessarily difficult for another. But the idea is that there is some meaningful disagreement between people. And so our interest here, of course, is in these kind of meaningful disagreements that happen at the intersection of science and Christianity, though I think that you might find these ideas relevant beyond these topics to other types of difficult conversations as well. One more caveat before we get started. I'm really focusing on kind of person-to-person conversation, person-to-person communication, rather than something like a speaker to an audience or through social media. I think that some of these principles absolutely still apply, but they might look a little bit different. So I'll keep that as a caveat, that I'm really talking about when you want to sit with a friend or a colleague or a peer or someone from your church and you want to have a difficult conversation. So this presentation will have two parts. I will start by talking very briefly about why we can't just talk data, right? Why do we have to pay attention to the person? Can't we just get into the data? And then I want to move into some tips from psychological science on engaging these difficult conversations well. And I'll provide 3 ideas generated out of psychology to this end. So for the first part, why can't we just talk about the data? I make my case for this in a paper published in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. It was published in December of 2020. And in this article, I described research that highlights how human reasoning is not rational and logical, right? At least not easily rational and logical. Instead, human reasoning is motivated by a number of competing and different influences that we may not be aware of. Thus, when we talk about motivated reasoning, we are saying that how we arrive at any conclusion is influenced by a number of factors, not just what the cold, hard facts and data tell us. In fact, research on motivated reasoning indicates that when we have influences that incline us to produce a certain kind of outcome, right? Accuracy to data is only one influence, but when we have these influences that incline us toward a certain outcome, we are more likely to engage the data in a way that makes that outcome supported, even if it's a total distortion of those data. And importantly, this is not something that liberals do, or that conservatives do, or that religious people do, or that non-religious people do. Right? What I'm describing, this distortion of data through motivated reasoning, this is something that humans do, right? Across all of these different spectrums, if you frame the question in kind of a way, in certain ways, we all engage in patterns of motivated reasoning. One reason for this kind of motivated reasoning, this pervasive and persistent motivated reasoning, is the fact that we do not come to any data neutral, right? As we see and engage with data, we are influenced by our histories, we're influenced by our culture, we have implicit bias, our current moods, right? And a number of other factors that we bring to bear on any one interaction. And all of these things serve like these kind of pre-filters for how we will see, understand, and ultimately evaluate the data. This is especially true when we are engaging difficult conversations that cut across identity boundaries, as in, I'm a part of group X that believes Y. And so if you show me data that Y is wrong, you aren't just threatening my belief in Y, but you're actually threatening my membership to the group that believes that thing, right? And so it's in these contexts that we see that the data aren't just about the data, but rather it has all of these other influences that we bring to bear on how we are going to engage. We discussed this article in a diving deeper discussion. So I'm not actually going to get into the material that I outline in this paper, though I welcome conversation on this during the question and answer period. I will say that really the conclusion from that paper, and a conclusion that I will reiterate here, is that is that content matters, right? Content matters, but only if it's heard. So let me be clear. And I'm going to say it again, even though I just said it a moment ago and I stuttered through it. Content absolutely matters. The data, the truth, the facts, they matter, right? But the data on their own don't matter. It matters when they are heard and engaged. So I liken this question to the tree falling in the woods. When the tree falls, it's going to make vibrations, whether there are any sensory organs around to pick them up or not, right? Yet these vibrations don't mean anything without the sensory organs to make sense of them, right? You have sensation without perception, you have no meaning. And so you need the sensory organs to perceive the vibrations. And so if we take this analogy to data, science, truth matter. These vibrations are real, but they don't do anything without the sensory organs, right? And so if we think about this in terms of the communication of content at the intersection of science and faith, this means that we want the falling tree to be sensed, to be heard, because it is only with the hearing, the perception, that we can respond. And so it's at this point with an affirmation that content matters, but we have to first hear it, right, in a way that we can actually get to the content for it to matter. And so with this, I want to move into some ideas about how we can have more effective conversations, more effective, difficult conversations. And so really moving into the second part of this presentation then, I think we can say that there are many tips and tools that are generated out of psychological science for how to do better. And again, there's resources well beyond the scope of psychology that we can also draw from. Perhaps because of my training as a social scientist, where causes are multiply determined and they tend to be underdetermined, I'm inclined toward a view that the more places we can draw wisdom from for how to do better, the better the net outcome is going to be. And so today, acknowledging that the kind of landscape of ideas relevant to this conversation is quite broad, I'm going to focus in on 3 strategies generated from psychological science. So what I have here on the slide is the idea that, yes, there's ideas that come from more than psychological research, but I'm going to focus on these 3 here. And so for today, I've selected mindfulness, what I'm calling identified empathy, and the ladder of inference. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these strategies in turn for how to practice effective engagement. So mindfulness is probably a term that you have heard. It's a pretty popular term at this point, but it's also a bit of a nebulous term. For my purposes, I'm going to talk about mindfulness as an acute attention to the present moment. Mindfulness of the secular or the spiritual variety is increasingly a part of psychological interventions for mental health and well-being, right? To treat disorders and to promote flourishing. One of perhaps the most potent uses of mindfulness is in acceptance and commitment therapies, which, among other things, teach people to differentiate their observing self from their storied and verbal self. That is, we have thoughts, but we are not the thoughts. Part of what ACT therapy uses mindfulness for is to teach clients not to fuse, that's the word that they'll use, not to fuse with their thoughts, but instead to observe them and then to intentionally choose which thoughts they will accept as helpful. Right. So take, for example, an automatic thought that might pop into your head after you say something silly. You might think, gosh, I'm such an idiot. Right. And sometimes these thoughts happen so quickly, we don't even really identify them because we just kind of say them in our heads and then accept them as truth and move on. Right. And so part of what ACT does is it teaches us to identify this automatic, uncontrolled thought and then separate it as a thing that we can observe on its own. And so instead of reacting automatically and accepting it and moving on as if it were true, we can now essentially step back and say, I have had this thought that I'm an idiot. Okay. And then you can move on without fusing to that thought, without kind of accepting it as true and helpful in your life. And so essentially, by treating our thoughts as things that we can evaluate and select from, we can provide an important separation from negative and unhelpful thoughts, right? So the observing self is kind of saying, I can evaluate the stories that this verbal and storied self is serving up automatically and uncontrolled. But of course, this can only happen when we are deeply in tune and rooted in the present moments, hence the mindfulness piece. So there's quite a bit of nuance here that I'm just missing, but for my purposes, I want to suggest that when we practice this kind of mindfulness, we are more in touch with our internal narratives that go so easily unnoticed. Right? Narratives that may inhibit productive conversation. It's sometimes these narratives that lead us to wield data as if it were a weapon, right? Trying to bludgeon someone else into belief. This practice of bludgeoning people with data, as research on motivated reasoning makes clear, is really counterproductive. One of the books that I'm reading through right now is Rich Villados's 2020 book, The Deeply Formed Life, 5 Transformative Values to Root Us in the Ways of Jesus. And in his discussion on the interior world, without, from my knowledge, ever using the word mindfulness, he describes what I, as a psychologist, recognize as rooted in mindfulness practice as might be done in therapy. So he offers readers these 5 questions to ask and answer when we are trying to understand our reactions to events, right? When somebody disagrees with us or refuses to accept our interpretation of the data, and we have this really strong visceral reaction where we want to shout them into submission, right? And if they do submit, it's probably just because they've disengaged, right? And so when we have these strong counterproductive reactions, asking questions like this can help root us in the present moment to separate ourselves from the reactions in a way that can actually enhance the quality of future communications. Right. So we can ask ourselves, what happened? What am I feeling? What is the story I'm telling myself? What does the gospel say? And then what counterinstinctual action is needed, right? Rather than maybe throwing out more data, the instinctual response of many scientists, we want to listen and better understand the perspective of the other. This is an idea that will come full circle in just a couple moments. And so what I would suggest is that when we engage in difficult conversations, such as with a family member who's a vaccine skeptic or someone who rejects climate science, the conversation would be more productive if we spent the time to think through these questions, grounding us in that present moment. These questions, importantly, are not about them, right? It's about us. Right. And so I think that this is especially true when we have this urge to try to beat them over the head with data until they concede. Before moving on, I want to be clear that mindfulness is not a form of communication, right? But when we pay attention to our present state, including some emotions that might bubble up in difficult conversations, maybe that's just me, but it can make us the kind of people who are aware enough to communicate well. And when I say communicate well, what I really mean is that we're communicating in love and grace. As Christians, that should be one of our primary goals in communication. And mindfulness can help get us there. A second practice that I think is relevant to improving engagement in difficult conversations is what I'm calling identified empathy. Empathy is another word that can mean slightly different things, but for our purposes, I will describe empathy as the understanding of another's experience that moves you toward action. Thus, when you see a child cry being dropped off at the church nursery, you might be moved to offer a hug and a snuggle because you can imagine what they're feeling, right? Their parents are walking away and they feel alone and helpless and scared in this new environment, and you want to help them feel safe. However, empathy can kind of counterintuitively can backfire. What I mean here is that empathy narrows the scope of people that we think about and care for. Empathy is a bit like an emotional spotlight. When we feel moved by someone's plight, when we feel empathy, we are more likely to take action to help them. Someone else with an identical situation who is just less convincing or kind of less emotionally prodding for us for any number of reasons, they may not move our empathetic spotlight, and so we don't feel empathy for them. And this is really the basic argument that Paul Bloom makes in his 2016 book titled Against Empathy, A Case for Rational Compassion. Additionally, attempts to evoke empathy by putting yourself in someone else's shoes can actually harden you toward their plight when you believe them to be fundamentally dissimilar to you. That is, when they are value incongruent. So when we have a hard time understanding what it's like to be another person, right? Maybe because they're such an idiot or something like that. Like, I could never believe what that kind of person believes, right? And we've put them in a category that is altogether separate than the category we belong to. When we engage in this act of cognitive empathy, like wondering what it's like to be them, and we go through this intellectual exercise, research actually shows that it can make us more recalcitrant to act on their behalf, right? Because we can put ourselves in their shoes intellectually, but really it just furthers this kind of empathetic identification chasm, which makes the expression of empathy harder to have. And so what I suggest we do is practice what I'm calling identified empathy, where we first establish some sense of value congruence with another. Then we practice empathy so that we don't try to empathize with someone who we perceive to be utterly unlike us, someone who we have no sense of connection to. And so if we want to engage in productive conversations, we need to first recognize that the person we are talking to shares some important values with us, right? And we should be able to find something. Are they Christian? Do they share the core tenets of the faith, right? If they're not a Christian, do they share some fundamental belief about caring for others, protecting the weak, creating a community that serves the needs of others? If you're really struggling to find something of value in them, I think we can step back even further and say, do we take seriously that they, like us, were made in the image of God? And if so, that is worthy of respect and consideration, right? And so once we have identified something mindfully in the present moment, core to this person that we can see value in, right? That we can agree with, then we are in a better place to disagree. Note that identified empathy doesn't somehow make the disagreement go away, right? You can still disagree, but now you are not disagreeing with some distant other, but rather you are disagreeing with someone who you have already said you value because of some shared perspective or some core tenet of kind of who they are as someone made in the image of God. And so disagreement in that context is less likely to other them, to put them into this category that is wholly separate from you. So many conversations go poorly, in part because we dehumanize the other. We so kind of separate them from us. Identified empathy, rooted in identifying with something important to you in them, will set the stage for you to engage respectfully. Finally, the third practice that I think can improve difficult conversations is to climb down the ladder of inference. Climbing down this ladder is easier to do, perhaps it's only possible, when we are mindful and practicing identified empathy. The ladder of inference, which was developed by an organizational psychologist, describes all the steps that go into any action we take. For example, how we engage or disengage in difficult conversations. Many of the components of our actions are informed by automatic thoughts we have, driven by heuristics and shortcuts in our cognition. And so when we have the very human thought that any reasonably smart person would obviously agree with me, that really sets us up to, as if when we disagree with someone, which is going to happen, that they're obviously not a reasonable and smart person, right? Because they've disagreed with you. And so in these circumstances, which really might categorize all difficult conversations, we need to spend some time to go down the ladder. Our actions, how we engage, flow out of our beliefs and conclusions, which are just a few steps beyond our assumptions, how we understand reality, and then at the bottom, reality itself. So when we climb down this ladder, it helps us to see the source of the conflict, the disagreement in the difficult conversation more clearly. Because remember, it's not about the data per se, but about the potential threat that the data pose to something more fundamental to the person, right? So this could be identity, pride, whatever. And so if we start here at the bottom of the ladder, we have at the very bottom, reality and facts. These are your data. But when we engage in a difficult conversation, we aren't usually down here at the bottom of the ladder. I actually might argue that we can only ever kind of approximate the bottom of the ladder because from these facts and data, we have to interpret them, right? And so this is based off of our previous experiences, biases, beliefs. This is going to influence how we see the data, how we interpret what they mean, how we speak for the data. And then, of course, if we think about this in light of motivated reasoning, we also are going to have some automatic assumptions that can be so easily applied to these data and our conversation partner about these data. So those automatic thoughts that I described in mindfulness, in the context of therapy, we usually think about how they're applied to ourselves. And I think that's important. But we also have automatic thoughts that are generated about others. And I think those are equally important to identify. And so when we start with the data, it's very quick that we end up in this realm of making assumptions where we're not really talking about the data, but rather all of the layers that we bring to this non-neutral data interaction. And so as we continue up the ladder where we might want to start engaging conversations about what data mean and what we believe about them and what we should do about them, this is, I think, where things get really interesting. At the top part of the ladder, we have conclusions, which are founded at least in part on interpretations and assumptions that we may not have evaluated. They just popped into our head and we kind of accepted them as if they were inherent in the data themselves. And then from these conclusions, we develop beliefs. And at the highest level, we take actions that are self-evident because they're based on what we believe, right? And it's just like, of course, this would be the logical next step that I do. So to connect this more clearly, to connect this ladder of inference more clearly to a difficult conversation, you have a belief based on data, but when someone else rejects, distorts, or disagrees with you, what level of the ladder you are on when you respond, and importantly, what kinds of beliefs, conclusions, etc., are you making about them as your conversation partner that can negatively impact your ability to continue to engage and to continue to engage well, right? Asking yourself where on this ladder you are, I think, is a really critical question. I think this is really the value in thinking about the ladder of inference, figuring out where you are as you are trying to have a conversation with someone, what you are bringing about them and their actions and their beliefs, where you are in this ladder in interpreting there. So when we climb down the ladder of inference, it can help us get back to the facts. So, for example, there's some research on climate change perceptions that indicate that even when individuals may be willing to accept the scientific data, when the data are presented in a way that is at odds with their political ideology, they are much less likely to accept that data as trustworthy. This kind of understanding is hard to get until we climb down the ladder to figure out what we're really arguing about. Right? Are we arguing about the data, or are we arguing about political ideology? Right? And if we both kind of jump to certain conclusions and beliefs without really trying to kind of unpeel the onion here, we can actually be within a conversation with someone else where maybe you're talking about the data and they're talking about political ideology, and both of you assume you're talking about the same thing, and yet you're not. To be clear, I think both of those probably need to be discussed, but it's important that you are having the same conversation as your conversation partner. And as we climb down the ladder of inference, why do you react that way? Help me understand your perspective there, right? What other evidence are you bringing to bear? Right? How do you think about this kind of evidence, right? And really trying to step down. So not just what do you think about climate change, for example, but what are you bringing into your package of reality and how are you interpreting it and why moving it ever so slightly down the ladder can be really productive. Right? Because once you've descended the ladder to understand what data, facts, and perceptions are driving their reaction, then you can structure the conversation in a way that acknowledges the perspective of the other rather than fighting it, especially when you're fighting that perspective invisibly because it hasn't actually been identified in the conversation. So at this point, some of you may be returning to the question, but what about the content, right? At this point, a lot of what I've described is about getting our hearts and our minds ready and asking questions to kind of peel back the layers and descend this ladder of inference and really trying to find value in the other person. And it seems almost like I've ignored the content completely. And in some ways, that's right. Right? Everything I've talked about has really been about preparing you for engaging, preparing me for engaging. And this is because psychological research on belief change, on motivated reasoning and the interpretation of data and so forth, generally converges on the finding that facts follow friendships, right? We cannot engage difficult science-based conversations productively unless we first engage the human person in front of us. And so importantly, engaging well doesn't always feel good, right? Could just be me here, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that engaging well using the ideas that I've described here doesn't always feel good. But sometimes, perhaps as a result of our human condition, doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, right? When I have to discipline my children, it doesn't feel good. I don't like it, but it's still the right thing to do, right? And so even though it doesn't always feel good, that doesn't somehow make it less right in terms of effective engagement. It's in this vein that I would also suggest that Jesus didn't interact with all people the same. Right? He didn't levy the same challenges and same critiques to all people. It's not that Jesus's truth changed, but his delivery in the knowledge of the needs and the heart of the other, his delivery changed. And so I think that we, in the context of relationships, have opportunities to know others. And in that knowing, challenge and share truth in difficult conversations, including those within the domain of our scientific expertise. And if we take Jesus's example seriously, then we will do this and refrain from the often better feeling, but less effective, shout them into submission method. And so as I draw this discussion to a close, as we prepare to open up into a period of question, answers, and discussion, I want to remind you why I think this matters. Christians are interested in truth. Right? But I would argue that our quest for truth is not the same as the quest for perfection. Modeled in our beliefs about redemption, we grow, we learn, we change our minds. In fact, if we never change our mind, we probably aren't worshiping God, but rather some idealized version of ourselves, right? I'm thinking about this broadly here. And so I think that we should care about having accurate representations of the world. And so we should take the time to engage in difficult conversations, to sift through our own motivated reasoning and to help guide others to points of understanding so that we can speak truth responsibly. And I think that when we speak truth responsibly, that allows us to be people who can be trusted to speak truth, right? When we're trusted in one domain, although it's an empirical question, I think it transfers to other domains as well. And so it is with that I say thank you for your time and attention up to this point, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Well, very good. Thank you again for recording that, Erin. It's remarkable to me the timeliness of this conversation and what you've been leading us in. We are in a moment, nearly 2 years into the COVID pandemic, which we know is stressing virtually every aspect of our lives. And in particular, this is one area that shining a bright light on is our ability to have fruitful conversations with one another. And all of us have experienced that again and again. Vicki and I, as we travel around the country, as we do these Zoom conversations, we see again and again people saying, I'm having difficulties. I'm having difficulties in my church, with my pastor, with my family members. And hopefully we don't have spouses that are having difficult conversations. And yet this is so helpful, to have you drawing that literature and then bringing it into practice. So looking for hand raises.
Perhaps this will break the ice a little bit. You said, hopefully it's not with spouses. I will say some of my most difficult conversations are with my spouse when we find areas that we disagree in this. And there are times where I fall into all the things that this research tells me not to do. And it's like, okay, I love you enough that we need to take a break so I can get my head in the right space to actually engage well. Because the way that I'm engaging is like my old habits, they die hard, right? They're built into my neural circuitry, but I'm gradually through each better conversation informed by what research says I should be doing and modeled after the example of Jesus, I'm better able to have those difficult conversations. So I feel the need to say that I present on this, but it's not because I'm really good at it. I'm not particularly good at having these difficult conversations. I think that's why I'm drawn to understand how to do it better.
Good. Exactly. Thank you.
I think that's a helpful talk, Erin. And I think, I'm the kind of guy who wants to barge in with the data. And I'm the kind of guy who thinks these people are so stupid that, I ought to bash them. And I'm thinking particularly of a scenario that I have written it down and actually sent it to my pastor, but it's the issue, of the anti-vax movement and the basis for anti-vaccination, the basis for their being against it is that, there was a embryonic cell line that was used in developing the vaccine. Now, my thought is, I was thinking I would like to come at him and say, well, you say you're worried about an embryonic cell line. Why are you worried about one baby from 50 years ago when you could immediately benefit babies in utero in your own church, namely pregnant mothers? You don't want to be passing on COVID to them because, particularly with this Delta variant, pregnant women are suffering miscarriages. So the real live babies in utero now. Now I'm thinking the better way to say it instead of, bashing them. Well, if you really believe you know, those in utero, you know, have rights. I think the better thing to say it would be to come at that person with what you said about finding an area of agreement. And that is, the agreement is we both value the life in utero.
Yeah,
so it's a question of, well, what's the best way to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Do we think about one baby way back there, or do we think about 5 or 6 babies currently in utero right in the church where, you know, you're interacting with people and could be passing something on?
David, let's let Erin. That's a great question. Thank you. Erin, how do we respond on that?
Yeah. So the old joke for psychologists is, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, I don't know, because the light bulb has to want to change itself, right? So like, you need to identify in yourself your own tendencies first. And so I appreciate that you started by saying your inclination in this is to go in with boxing gloves on, right? Covered in data. And the first step is to take those boxing gloves off. And even in your question, you've identified a point of shared value, protection of human life. And so I think that when you start from that point of shared value and just ask questions. So one thing I didn't talk about in the presentation is there's a conflict resolution strategy known as compassionate curiosity. And in this, you first acknowledge and validate someone else's emotions, and then you get compassionately curious about them. And so instead of going in and saying, why are you valuing one instead of valuing the many, go in and say, I see that we share a belief about the value of human life and the importance of scientific practice to protect human life and science to be applied in the community in a way that promotes the dignity of human life, right? These are all things that are consistent with both views. And now you, of course, in your head, you have other ideas about the way that they might not be playing out evenly, but you're focusing on the things you agree on. And then from there, ask questions. I think that when we are compassionately curious about how these shared values get applied, especially when we as outside observers can see that they are applied asymmetrically, right? So what you're commenting on, and I think where your frustration is that you see it applied to one baby and at the cost of all of these others, right? And at the cost of the exceptional risk to older adults. And so you're seeing an asymmetry, but instead of just pointing that out, right? Like, look how bad your reasoning is. It's so asymmetrical because you say you believe this, but look at what you're missing. Instead of coming at it that way, ask questions and find out why is it and how is it that they came to form this belief the way it is. And I will tell you, when you leave that conversation, their mind is probably not going to be changed. And it is not going to feel satisfying to you because you're not going to have left with sweat broken because you had your boxing gloves on. But just because you leave that conversation having asked and valued the other person, they will be in a better position to actually think about what you've said and listen, right, in the future. When you come in and just try to kind of beat them into a corner, which we can do with data, right? We can do that sometimes, but if that's how you approach, as soon as you walk away, they're going to run out of that corner and then avoid you. And so what you want to do is be the kind of person who values them, who acknowledges that there are things that they believe that you too believe and they're important, and you just want to open up opportunities for conversation. And in that, I think could follow the possibility of then being able to speak some truth and acknowledge that asymmetry, but in a non-threatening way, because you've already established that pattern. That's
Erin,
what I would say.
Erin, thank you. That's so good. We've got other questions lining up here. That's really helpful. I see Rick Lindroth. Rick, you want to come forward, unmute?
Sure, yeah. First of all, Erin, just really great presentation. Thank you. As background, I'm a professor of ecology, and I do a lot of research on and speaking about climate change. And so I've been doing a deep dive into this very topic over recent years to try to understand how I can better communicate to lay audiences. I'm going to put you on the spot if I may, and feel free to beg off. I've found the work of Jonathan Haidt really helpful. The moral foundations theory, at least in a secular sense. Would you feel comfortable enough to comment on that from perhaps a Christian perspective? And does it ring true to you or what?
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, I recommend you start with, I think it was published in 2005, the book he wrote titled Righteous Minds. And it deals specifically with kind of the split between the right and left political ideologies. And really what accounts for some of the vitriol that comes out of these very extreme positions that are the ones that rise to the top in media conversations. And he makes an argument that conservatives and liberals actually start with a different orientation towards what they think is important, these underlying values. And so I do think that it's really helpful to think about, and this is why I say start with something that you share a value with them, because if you are talking to somebody who believes very different things than you do, you don't want to make them reason from your perspective, but there's probably some strand of overlap that you could start with. And I think that we see that in the person of Jesus. So you asked me to speak of, kind of as a Christian. I think that we see that in the person of Jesus. I think we see that in the person of Paul, right? That he didn't go to everybody with the same argument, but he started with the arguments of the culture, and then from there built to Jesus, from there built to truth. And so I think that what Haidt's work does and what it communicates is thinking about the underlying value structures that support a person's belief. And if you're arguing over here, but their value system is over here, you're never going to make traction.
Thank you, Erin. That's helpful. And Rick, thanks for that question, because I've seen Jonathan Haidt's name and work in the literature, in particular on these conversations. It's very helpful. I'm going to go. Arnie, go ahead.
Okay. I took Psychology 101 in university several decades ago, and that was the extent of my education in psychology. But I've always been interested in psychology, and recently I have become aware of a practice in Christian psychology, I guess you could call it, which is called nouthetic counseling. And from my understanding, it seems like nouthetic counseling rejects some aspects of the science of what I call secular psychology, the Jonathan Haidts of the world. And I wonder, like, this was founded by Dr. J. Adams a long time ago, and I'm just wondering and curious whether you're familiar with that, and how much of a contribution this is making in the whole area of Christian psychology.
So it's a good question. And like a good academic, I'll say I've not actually heard of it, but then I'm going to answer your question anyways. So I've not heard of this, but what you're describing taps into a broader conversation that's happening among Christian psychologists about, is there such a thing as a distinctly Christian psychology? Like, could we start with theology and then out of those assumptions develop a science that would look different than when we start with the assumptions of science or kind of more secular cultural structures? This is a conversation that is, I'm not going to wade into it beyond that, but to say that people disagree very strongly about whether there is a viability for a Christian psychology as something separate and distinct from what we would find in mainstream psychology. My own approach starts with what I would call mainstream psychology, and then tries to carry psychology as far as it can. And then once we've kind of exhausted what the data can say, I look around and say, what other tools are at my disposal, right? And that's my own kind of current working model. So it doesn't really answer your question, but it's what I can give.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Arnie. And I noticed that we have Ian Prince has put a little note up in the chat, so be sure you take a check there. If you're interested in following up on Jonathan Haidt's book, looks like the Henry Center. Henry Center, as you might know, is one of our partner organizations and was a sponsor, co-sponsor with us this summer for our annual meeting, and brought in a number of speakers and And so thanks, Ian, for putting that notice in there and that link. Appreciate that. So Mark McEwen, Mark, we haven't forgotten you, but do you want to come back? Start with Mark.
Okay, at long last. No, thank you. I found that intriguing, Erin. Thank you for that talk. The ladder you presented, it made me think of a lot of reflection I've been doing on intellectual honesty and what it means, how to define it. And I would be interested to know how you would think of it in terms of the ladder you presented. I guess specifically trying to recognize the difference between intellectual dishonesty and just somebody has a different starting point, for example, in their assumptions. Or anyway, I would like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I might be sidestepping it a little bit, but I think that we all have to acknowledge that we have different starting points. Even if we have articulated as far as we possibly could what our starting part is, and we say, oh yes, we 100% agree with one another, we still have different starting points because we're not the same people. And so the way that I would think about this, again, just spitballing a little bit here, is that intellectual honesty is the continual willingness to re-examine our assumptions in light of new data, right? It doesn't mean that all beliefs are equal, all opinions are not the same, right? They have there might be a different weight of evidence required to shift our beliefs. But I think what an intellectually honest person should be willing to do is say, and what were the assumptions that preceded this, right? It is one of my favorite books. Was it's a book that hardly anybody knows about. It's published by the APA on what are the assumptions of psychological science and what are some alternative frameworks. When you look at the philosophy of science, it's really hard to examine your own assumptions. And yet when you do, you realize that the interpretations that flow out of data could look a number of different ways. And oftentimes we only realize that when we look at history. So it's really hard to do that in the moment, to imagine other alternative explanations. But I would imagine that to think about intellectual honesty in this context means we're willing to acknowledge that the framework we have now might not actually be, because it might be dependent on assumptions that we haven't yet articulated. I don't know if that's a fair answer or in the realm of what you were thinking about.
Oh, thank you. That's very helpful. So I have to think about it more.
Very good. Thanks, Erin, for that response. I just had to smile when you said one of your favorite books is what are the assumptions of psychological science? I guess you and I might have different starting points. And so I'll see if that becomes a favorite book. But oh, that's great. Thanks. We have another question. I see a hand raised. Dana, you want to, Liskowitz, Dana, you have a question?
Yeah, great talk. I really enjoyed it. I recently read a book called Don't Label Me by Irshad Manji, and it's more on the secular side, and it speaks very well to what you were presenting as far as othering folks, and then we can shut our ears and hearts by having that othering happen. And I think with what's happening right now, particularly with COVID, oftentimes these are individuals that we don't consider to be others. They are church members, fellow church members. They are family members. So the book had some practical tips on how to take a look at that othering, but when we're already starting out at very opposing and opposite views. Do you have any tips to offer for those who aren't necessarily in those such polarized aspects to the conversation? Thank you.
That's a great question. Othering this process, in psychology, we talk about in groups and out groups. And so what you're saying is, what do we do with people who we disagree with, who we already have designated as in our in group? And I think that the first thing I would say is actually examine to what extent that difference keeps them in our in group. So much of this in-group, out-group psychology is really implicit, meaning outside of our conscious awareness. And we do it in ways that go unnoticed by us. And so even things like the off the cuff comments, pay attention at Thanksgiving, right? The off the cuff comments that happen about like weird Uncle Al, right? Or whatever the case. So like even that adjective, to what extent does that make him, yeah, he's part of our family, but he's on the peripheral of the family. He's in here because we've pre-decided, we've a priori put him in this circle. But if it wasn't for that, he'd probably be on the outside, right? And I think about divisions that happen in churches because they are irreconcilable differences. At one point, we were one group, but we let the festering of otherness within this group ultimately lead to a place where we're now two groups. And it seems to happen very quickly, but actually, I think it festers under the surface for a really long time. And so I think my first answer, which again is, I'm really good at not answering the questions you guys are asking me. But I think the first thing I would do is really take an honest examination of our heart and ask ourselves, are we othering them? Are we somehow treating them as different or distinct because of this disagreement? And when it is a high stakes disagreement in terms of value and identity, I think it's more likely, and it's more likely to go unnoticed because that's threatening to a relationship. But then from there, all of my same tips would apply. Start with values, start with agreements, start with affirming the other and making the relationship safe. That is, you are allowed to disagree with me and we can still be members of this family who get along and love each other because of who God has made us to be together, right? That we don't have to agree on eye to eye, and I want to hear and I want to understand your perspective. So that would be the exact same kind of mechanisms and techniques that I've been talking about.
Very good. Thank you, Erin. I see Robert Strauss has got raised his hand. Robert, can you unmute?
Yes, thank you for that information, Erin. And certainly your information about being friendly before the facts, I have found very effective, not only when speaking with Christians, but non-Christians alike, in finding that common ground to build on that conversation. But my question is, in group dynamics, often comments come up that can be often highly opinionated or lacking factual reality. Yeah. And often in those situations, I will probably demonstrate more forbearance in allowing them just to be wrong rather than to continue the conversation in any way. I'm just curious, in a group dynamic situation, how you would approach that with your techniques.
Yeah, it's a great question, especially for educators in the room. I mean, it's not limited to a classroom, but students come into a classroom and you might be teaching something about science and they very confidently assert something that is 100% inconsistent with even the sentence you just said out of your mouth. And so how do you both communicate to the classroom that's incorrect, but also in a way that treats the student with value and dignity and doesn't shut them down? Right, because that's not how they are going to change. One of the ways before this semester, I took a workshop on how to ask better questions for that context. And I think that, again, I would go back to even how I answered David Saunders' question, which is, instead of just saying, that's incorrect, instead, if there is time and space to ask questions, where did that evidence come from? Can you tell me how you formed that perspective? And having a set of almost pre-established word stems, question stems that can prompt a little bit reflection and ask them to peel back their own layers of assumptions. So you're telling me you think that because you're a Christian. Could you imagine a Christian who thinks something different? Can you point to where in theology that is the requirement of that belief? And at the end of the day, if you don't have a lot of time, one thing you could just say is, I've not heard that. I don't think we're on the same page there. I'd like to circle back to that when we have more time. For now, we need to keep talking about this. And so you've kind of put a pin on it and you've let your objection be noted, but in a way that didn't demean them, in a way that just, we're not on the same page. And so at some point, other people are going to need to evaluate who is trustworthy in that context. but it also leaves open the possibility for future conversations.
Robert, thank you for that question. And Erin, that's a remarkable answer. I ought to thank you for that too, because it just twigged something in my mind. It's how do we apply this elsewhere? And my question for the audience is, what made you smile? What made you think of yourself in this talk today? Because I have about 3 or 4 of them. And what I'm thinking of right now is these nuisance phone calls that you get. I'm retired now, so Kathy and I are home quite a bit. And so the phone calls come in, and you get it from a call center, and it's, "Good afternoon, Mr. Wood. Thank you very much for your gift," or whatever the spiel is. And typically after a bit, it's a stop. And then I started this with the wrong motive. I started saying, "Yes, how may I help you?" And I kept pushing them because I wanted them to stop. So, but now I've realized over time that typically folks that are working in call centers are often entry-level jobs, immigrants to our country. You find, people who have challenge with the English language. And I don't want to beat up on these folks. I mean, I may not agree with the company and their strategy, but I don't have anything with. So I'm saying, how can I help you? And it stops the conversation and turns it in a different direction. And that's, I think, what you've been saying to us here. That was one observation, but I just noticed too that what is the role of each other in helping I had a colleague who helped me when I was really messing up in a conversation. Someone had said something, and I started imparting motive to that person. I said, "Well, they said this because of this, this, and this." And that colleague just stopped me in my tracks and said, "John, you don't really know their motive." So what's our role with each other in helping each other be better conversationalists, better questioners?
Yeah, I think that we all need a community who we have given explicit permission to comment on that. Right. So if we all start to engage in a way that is suggested here, asking lots of questions, practicing curious compassion, kind of trying to climb down the ladder of inference, we need to have people who we've invited into our life that we've said, "You know what, if you see me engaging in different kinds of patterns, you have my permission to cut to the chase and to challenge me directly. And I know that when you challenge me directly, starting with the content, that I'm going to pay attention because I've given you that card, that you have that role in my life." Right? But I don't think that's just true about how we have these conversations. I think we need community like that as modeled in scripture, that there should be people who we do life with so intimately that the friendships are solid enough that they can actually start with those facts, that they can say, "I see this about you." And I'm wondering, I mean, it's even there, you're still asking questions, but I'm wondering why that was the choice that you made. I'm wondering if there might have been other options, and helping us even work through that. Yeah, so I think community is a really big part of, I'm just going to say, human life, but especially in these kinds of conversations where we don't typically get critiques. We don't often know if we're successful or if we engaged well. And so to have people who've been invited to speak truth, to comment and help correct us, I think is really important.
Yeah, inviting honest evaluation. That's great. So I think we'll let John Tandy, he's raised his hand, and let John have the last question here. John.
Well, kind of maybe a couple of comments. I really appreciate the conversation in the article. I've got a bookmark in that article, so I can come back to it because I need to be reminded of it, and very timely also because I've got a difficult conversation in about 2 days that I realize I'm doing all the wrong things of making othering and other things. But more of a comment. There was a book I read sometime recently, a few years ago, and I'm sure it would be considered more pop psychology, but Never Get Angry Again by David Lieberman. And is really kind of dealing with anger, but also a broader thing of, and the point that I thought might tie in here is perspective. And one of the examples he gives is, you walking down the street and someone slams into you, and you're all angry, and then all of a sudden you see that they've got a cane in front of them and they're blind. Well, all of a sudden your anger dissipates and you have empathy, the situation didn't change, but what changed was you and your perspective. And so kind of like broadening the perspective in kind of concentric rings further and further out to, and I think that's really kind of gets maybe the heart of what you're saying, is that our perspective needs to broaden, and then we're less emotionally engaged, I guess, and more able to rationally deal with the situation.
Yeah. If I might, I'm not sure that we're less emotionally engaged, but I think we're more emotionally in tune. So one of the best ways to do this, to have these conversations well, is to be firmly rooted in who Jesus is, to be formed from the inside out, where our initial reaction when we get bumped into on the street is not to react with anger, but instead to give the benefit of the doubt and to say, there are things happening in this person and in this person's mind and life that I don't know. So how can I be the hands and feet of Jesus to this stranger? Right. And maybe that just means I keep walking and do nothing. Maybe it means I turn and see if I can actually help. Right. That you've taken my cloak. Let me give you my jacket. Right. So I think that this is something that I've been chewing on, that what is the role of formation and how we anchor our interior life in the person of Jesus, and what that means for how our behavior flows out. And of course, our behavior here is how we engage with data, but also how we engage in the world in general. And so as I say this, please know that I'm saying this, the words are easy, but the actual doing, I think, is really difficult, which is why I'm so thankful that God has given us an entire life to continually return to him and say, that was not quite right. Teach me, Lord. That was not quite right. Teach me, Lord. And part of the tools that I think God has given us is science, including psychological science, that can tell us different ways that we might do it. But if we're just trying to win conversations by using psychology to do it better, I don't actually think that's that helpful. But if we're kind of using psychology and other tools as tools that have been given to us by God to continually form ourselves and shape the world in a way that reflects the character of Christ, then I think it's worth it.
Yeah, and just briefly, that I think that was his point in the book, really, with anger was, you can't deal with anger after you're angry. You have to learn to deal with anger by not getting angry in the first place. And that was kind of the tools. And it wasn't specifically a Christian book, but it definitely brought in Christian principles, I felt like, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
John, thank you for that question. And Erin, thank you for that response. As you were talking, I'm thinking that really puts a kind of capstone on this talk today. You pointed us to Jesus as our example and encourager. And the challenge that we have, I am thankful too that we have a lifetime, but I'm also thankful that we have a community of ASA and scholars like yourself who are willing to share what God has gifted and called you to do, because that encourages and helps to shape all of us in our lives. I mean, that's an important thing of what the ASA is. We are a community of scholars and professionals and folks who want to engage these questions, and have been doing it for 80 years. And we did it this summer with the Henry Center questions on scientia and the common good. And we're going to do it again next summer in ASA 2022, which will happen hopefully out at Point Loma. If COVID cooperates, we will be there in person this next summer, looking at what is a human, flourishing as a person. In a day when CRISPR technology has won the Nobel Prize, when Jane Goodall has won the Templeton Prize this year, and we asked their question, what is a human and how do we flourish in the midst of this situation? So big questions. We will have a program for you, but before that happens, be sure after Christmas in January to be ready for our conversation with Philip Yancey. And he's just completed a book on the reflections on John Donne and during the plague in London. And he's going to bring some of that forward to talk about his views and his ideas and insights on what it's like to be a Christian today in the midst of COVID. We're going to have that conversation on a Saturday at the end of January. So look for the announcements that will be making their way, out to you soon. And Erin, thank you so very much for being with us today. And we will see you at our next ASA event.